Okay, hi everybody. My name is Matt Savis with the Lean Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by Art Byrne today. I'm going to give everybody a minute or so to come into the webinar space. This is broadcast through LinkedIn, and we had a nice number of people registered for this thing. Let's make sure that everybody can get in. So, let's get started by just giving a quick overview of the platform. So the webinar today is largely going to be Q&A. You'll have a chance to ask Art all sorts of questions. And to do that, you want to use the comments feature in the event space. And so let's just test that out first here. So if you could all just tell me just your name and where you're from. Just post that in the comments and make sure everybody's familiar with how to use that. I'll give it a few seconds here. Again, just post your name and where you're from in that comment section to make sure that everybody's comfortable using that feature. We're going to be using it a lot today. Let's see if I can be the first one to do this successfully. Here they go. We have Pedro from Portugal. Welcome, Pedro. Ann Arbor, Michigan. Jody from Medina. Mark Galloway from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Great. Yeah, just go ahead for people just joining. We're just asking people to put their name and where they're from in the comments. All right, loads of people coming in now. That's great. We have Rich from Arizona, Becky from Michigan, Nicholas from Paris. Great. I'm always surprised at how international the audience is for these events. Somebody from Switzerland, the UK, Botswana. Wow. It's amazing who you can reach through LinkedIn. And James down in Boston. I'm based in Portland, Maine. And now that everybody knows how to use this feature, we're comfortable with it, I'll go ahead and kick us off with a bit of introduction. So for those unfamiliar with the Lean Enterprise Institute, we're a 501c3 nonprofit headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, with a mission to make things better by advancing lean thinking and practice. We do that all kinds of ways. We have loads of free content on our website, lean.org. We also host workshops, trainings, and also community events, including our biggest event. That's the Lean Summit. That's coming up March 5th and 6th next year in Atlanta, Georgia. If you register by January 31st, you save a bunch of money on the registration price. You can also get a group discount by registering 5 people or more. LEI also serves its mission by publishing books, and our latest book is Daily Management to Execute Strategy. It's a wonderful practical guide on how to implement an effective daily management system. And some things that it covers is how to connect daily management, how to connect high-level strategy to frontline operations, how to develop an effective visual management board, and how to create a help chain so that frontline operators can escalate problems when they cannot solve them successfully on their own. So head to lean.org/store to check out that great new book. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Art Byrne. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Art. He is a globally recognized expert with over 40 years of experience implementing lean principles to drive operational excellence and business transformation. As the former CEO of the Wiremold company, Art spearheaded a groundbreaking lean transformation that resulted in substantial growth, increased profitability, and improved employee engagement. He has since applied lean across various industries, both as a practitioner and as an advisor. He's also the author of 3 books, The Lean Turnaround, The Lean Turnaround Action Guide, and his latest book, which is up on screen here, The Lean Turnaround Answer Book. And with that, I will welcome Art to the stage here. Thanks for joining us here, Art.
Well, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So let's see. Just a quick thing. Somebody here already said the transmission froze for some people. Just refresh your LinkedIn, and that should solve that problem. Um, So today's webinar, we don't have a presentation prepared. There aren't slides. This is really just purely Q&A. So go ahead, as you have questions for Art, post them in the chat, just like you posted your name and where you're from. And as those questions come in, I'm going to go ahead and just find ones to answer. But I'll start things off here. Maybe some people aren't familiar with you, Art, and I'm a bit of a history nerd, so I like to start with a bit of background. And so, can you just share how you first got introduced to all this lean stuff and your early career, just trialing these ideas and the success you managed to have with them?
Sure. My first introduction to this was during my first general manager job at the General Electric Company. I was the general manager of the high intensity and quartz lamp department in Cleveland, Ohio. And this was in January of 1982. So I've been doing this for quite a while. Um, and right before I became the general manager, my operations vice president and one of the other operations guys from the group they went to Japan in a trip that was sponsored by corporate manufacturing of GE. And as a result of them going, they had to come up with something that they did 6 months later and presented to the corporate manufacturing group. And so what they chose to do was to create just a simple Kanban system. And they asked me what I thought, and I said, well, I had read a little bit about this stuff at the time because 1982 wasn't that long after the 1979 oil crisis, and that's really the first time anybody in the West kind of learned about this Toyota production system, because Toyota seemed to sail through that oil crisis better than anybody, and people wanted to understand how did they do that. So anyway, we created just a Kanban system. What we did is we bought a little truck. Their factory was about 45 minutes from my factory, and they were supplying me arc tubes, little arc tubes. We were making the high intensity and quartz lamps that you see outdoors or in high bay factories, that kind of thing. And they were supplying the arc tubes for high pressure sodium lamps, and these were pretty complicated little things and pretty valuable. Anyway, what we did is we just created a Kanban card for every tray of these arc tubes, and every morning their truck would show up at our plant, and we would give them the Kanban cards from the arc tubes we used yesterday, and the next day they'd bring those back. That was it. That's all we did. And what happened was fairly quickly, my inventory went from 43 days worth of this stuff down to 3 days. And their inventory, they had a whole room full of these arc tubes, and they just emptied it out. They had none. So they probably had 60 days before, and they went to zero. And that was nice. But at the time, the mentality in GE was strictly make the month. No one cared about inventory turns or any of that kind of stuff. So we didn't get any pats on the back for that. But what we did find out was, gee, just because we did this, so many other things got better. My customer service got better. My quality got better. My productivity got better. The shop floor was cleaner. My accident levels went down. My people were happier, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, gee, I've got to learn more about this, because if I got all these side benefits, plus I reduced inventory and freed up a lot of cash, any business that I run from now on, I want to learn I want to use this approach. I just have to learn more about it. And fortunately, when I left GE to become a group executive at the Danaher Corporation, one of the companies that I was responsible for, a company named Jake Brake, and my office was in the Jake Brake building. Jake Brake was about ready to go out of business, really, and the guy that I had appointed to run it was a guy named George Konensaker. And George had some prior experience with the Toyota system before. He had worked at Rockwell and I think John Deere and some companies like that. And so the two of us, we said, let's use that to try and fix Jake Brake. And so we did. And we started out with Arthur Anderson Consulting. They said, oh, we know all about this stuff. And they were our auditors. And so we worked with them a little bit. But they were really typical US consultants, lots of PowerPoints, lots of cost, pretty slow. We did create a couple of cells. And at the same time, we were reading a book called Kaizen that was written by a guy named Masaki Amai. And Amai, it turned out a little while later, was going to hold a seminar in Hartford, Connecticut, which was just 2 towns away from us. We were in Bloomfield, Connecticut. So George Koenigsegger organized for 5 of his people to go, and I went for the first 2 days. And when we got there, they had the people that were doing the presentation was a new company called Shinjitsu. And this was just 3 guys that had all worked their whole career in Toyota. And they had all worked the last 10 years of their career directly for Taiichi Ono, who created the Toyota production system. They were responsible for implementing lean in the first tier suppliers of Toyota. And so, we said, wow, these are the guys we really need to have work for us because they're the ones that created this stuff, and they know how to do this. So anyway, we had them back to the plant a couple of times during the week, and then we had them on Saturday morning before they left town, and we basically begged them to come and help us. And their first response is, well, look, we're too old. It's too far away. We don't speak any English, and blah, blah, blah. And we said, wait a minute. We have really great steaks, and we have great fish and shrimp, and we have golf. We have great golf, and I think golf won the day because they really liked golf, and they decided, okay, we'll give it a try. And so we started with them at a sister plant from Jake Brake a few months later, and this was in Clemson, South Carolina, and the plant was Jacob's Chuck. And they were making drill chucks for electric drills. And so we got them there, and now this is in August, and it's hot, and we don't have any air conditioning in the plant. So we're all in blue jeans and golf shirts. They show up in suits and ties. And so we start out, we do a little introduction, then we say, let's do a 45-minute presentation on drill chucks. That lasted 3 seconds. Because they said, we have those in Japan too. What do you want to do next? So we said, well, let's take a plant tour. We thought, normal plant tour in that plant was maybe an hour and a half. We got about not even 100 yards into the plant, and Mr. Iwata holds up his hand and he says, okay, we've seen enough. Let's go back. We said, but Mr. Iwata, we just started. He said, that's okay. We've seen enough. We go back into the conference room, and he goes up on the board, and in really big letters, he just writes down, no good. And he says, everything here is no good. What do you want to do about it? And so that's how we started working with Shinjitsu. And, I would say that 90% of all companies, if they brought in a consultant, and the first thing he said, everything here is no good, they would have probably thrown him out right away. But we already knew everything was no good. We wanted them to help us. So we said, okay. I said, we're having trouble with our industrial chucks. And so he said, okay. Takanaka and Nakao, you guys go do that. So we took about eight of our engineers and managers and formed a team, and they went out to work on industrial chucks. And Iwata said, I like assembly, so I'm going to work on assembly. So myself and the president of Jacob's Chuck, we said, let's stay with Mr. Iwata and see what he has to say. So we go out to assembly, and we've got 4 of these conveyor belt kind of assembly lines set up there. The first thing he says, of course, is, I hate conveyor belts. Get rid of the conveyor belts. So okay. But he took us in and out of the office and explained why. Why did he hate the conveyor belts? Where was the waste? And he was showing us the waste, etc. After lunch, we went out to see what the other team was doing. And what we find is, here's the 2 Japanese consultants. They're in their shirt sleeves. They got their ties tucked into their shirts. And they got pry bars underneath a couple of machines that they're trying to, lift up from the grease and oil that has sucked them onto the floor. And I got 8 of my managers and engineers standing around with their mouths open. And basically they moved about 8 pieces of equipment that day and created the first one-piece flow cell at Jacob's Chuck.
Machines that probably hadn't been moved in.
Yeah, machines hadn't been moved in 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And we had the first cell. We couldn't rehook them back up in one day, but we had it all laid out, and they explained how it was supposed to work, et cetera. So that's really how we started with Shinjitsu. And they really taught us everything. They taught us, how do you run a kaizen? How do you organize it? How do you look to see the waste? What is it you're looking for? it was as much the mentality and the philosophy than anything physical or whatever.
Hmm.
And they were very different kinds of consultants. In fact, we never ever, they never ever gave us a PowerPoint. We never got any kind of written report from them ever. We just put them on the shop floor. We said we want to work on these 4 teams this week or whatever, and off they went. And that was kind of how the whole thing started. But um, we learned so much from them because they had such knowledge. They could look at something that we might have looked at for years and walked by it all the time, and right away they say, oh, "Look, that's no good. That's no good. This is no good," and then they could show you how to fix it. And so
Mm.
the knowledge we got from them was pretty amazing, and it was like drinking through a fire hose kind of at first, but we were making tremendous gains at Jacobs Chuck and Jacobs Brake.
Well, we already have a bunch of questions coming in from the audience, Art, and I'm going to ask the first one here. This is from Brian Calkins, and sort of related to your experience. I mean, you were bought in pretty quickly to these ideas, but this is a question that comes up from a lot of people. What's the most challenging experience you've had in getting executive buy-in, and how do you overcome that challenge?
Okay, this is a pretty normal question, um, and really the way that I always had resistance no matter where I was from the top management to start out with because they said, well, look, we don't make cars or whatever, we can't do this. Or when I went to Wiremold, for example, they had tried just in time a year or two before I got there, and it was a disaster. And so you have all these excuses. And so the way to overcome it really was lean is something that you learn by doing. And so the way I overcame it was the first kaizen we did, for example, at Wiremold, I made sure that all my direct reports were on one of the teams, because if you're not out there on the shop floor for the whole week, and this wasn't just visiting the team, this was being on the team full time, all the time for the whole week. And they all learned so much in 1 week. Their eyes really opened up. So we got to start with that, and then I just kept forcing them to be on these teams. And so I think that's really the best way to get buy-in like that. My finance guy, for example, is a very, very bright and strategic thinking guy, different than most finance guys. And when I first told him he was going to be on a team, he said, "Oh, Art, I'm the finance guy. I wanted to put him on a setup reduction team." And he said, "I don't know anything about setup. Plus, we're closing the books this week. The auditors are coming in." He had a whole list of why he couldn't do this. And I just said, no, get out there and get on the team. So he goes out there and he says, well, if we're going to reduce setup, that must be capital intensive. I'm going to keep track of all the money we have to spend this week to try and do this. So his team went from 90 minutes to 5 minutes that week, 90 minutes to 5 weeks in a week. And he kept track of everything we spent. It was about $100 because we had to do a little alterations here and there.
To get from 90 minutes to 5 minutes, you spend 100 bucks.
5 minutes, we spent $100. So he was bought in right away, and he became my best helper really in convincing everybody else, because he was smart enough to understand that, gee, if you can go from 90 minutes to 5 minutes and not spend any money, and that was on one machine, what would it be? What's the value to the company and the customer if we can do this across the board? And
Mm.
and he just bought in right away, and so he was a really big help to me. But that's, I think, the best way to get the management to buy in is put them out on the floor, put them in a kaizen, show them what this is, have them have the experience, start to teach them about lean, because you can't really lead a lean turnaround unless you're kind of a lean expert yourself. I don't think you can do.
Mm. Well, how important would you say is action? I mean, you compared the Arthur Anderson approach, more sort of PowerPoints, maybe standard training, versus action-based learning, action-based change.
Well, it's completely different. Think about the way that most companies go about solving a problem. They'll form a team of almost always salary people only, no hourly people, and then they'll meet every week, or let's say they meet once a month to figure out the problem and come up with a solution. So that drags on for several months. And when they finally come up with it, what they've done is they haven't done anything. All they've come up with is a plan to do something.
Mm,
And they have to get the plan approved. That might take another month. Whereas if you do kaizen and you're putting people on the shop floor, first of all, the teams aren't just all salaried. We always had half hourly and half salaried people on the team. Um, and we had very stretched goals to achieve during 1 week. And so by the end of 1 week, when the traditional approach hasn't done anything, we've already got a new cell, or we've cut the setup time from 90 minutes to 5 minutes, or some major things have occurred during that week. And so the difference is really, really dramatic
mm.
when you do it the Kaizen and lean way versus if you do it the traditional way.
Well, here's another question from the audience. This one from Kevin Hildreth. You were CEO, you were in charge, leading this effort. Sounds like really from the top down. But Kevin's asking, can you do it the opposite way? Can you start at the front line and then grow from there?
You can try that, but most of the time you're not going to get very far if you can't get your CEO or your owner on board. Um, I always get, whenever I do a presentation any place, I always get the question, how do I get my CEO on board? And that's the problem most people have, is they can't convince the CEO to do it. So my suggestion to that is, okay, if you can't, you can try and get him to go see some other lean companies. You can give him some books. You can do some other things like that. But probably the best way is if you're responsible for an area within the plant or within the business, and you can do some really good lean yourself there, and you can demonstrate that it can actually work in your company, and bring the CEO down and show him that's probably more powerful, because it's hard for him to say, well, look, we're not a car company. You can't work here. If you're standing right in front of something that is working there, right? So I think there's several different ways to do it, but if you can't get the CEO on board, you're not going to get very far. You can do the things that you can in the areas that you control, but it's not going to spread across the whole company. And if the whole thrust of the company is make the month, the lean it's pretty hard to do lean if the whole thrust is make the month, because lean is really nothing but a series of leaps of faith. Every time you try something, in the back of your mind, there's always the question of, well, what if this doesn't work? And so no one wants to take the risk of doing that if the drive from the top is you got to make the number.
Mm. Well, as somebody who has influenced so many companies, you're in a unique position because you're seen as an authority because of your success and also your influence through things like books, speaking, etc. But do you have any advice on how to convince leadership that this is a effective approach and they should change their behavior?
Well, certainly, you can show them the results that other companies have gotten from doing this.
Hmm.
I mean, the results are pretty dramatic. And I think if you show CEO or owner um, the kind of results that they can get, they ought to be interested in that. That I find that they're not that interested, actually, or that they think of it the wrong way. For example, in my experience, 90% of all the companies that start down the lean path, they do it because they think it's a cost reduction program.
Mm,
The reason they think that, of course, is that when you look at the results that successful lean companies have gotten, they get a lot of cost reduction. That isn't the strategic thing that they achieved, of course. It's not the biggest thing that they got, but you're going to get a lot of cost reduction on the side. I look at it always as a side benefit. And so, I think the first thing is just to show CEOs what's possible. Why wouldn't you want to do this in your company? Uh, the next thing I think would be, try and get them exposed to it in some way. Maybe they can go visit some companies that are successfully doing lean, and that might help them understand it. And then if you can find a good consultant and have them come in and run a couple of kaizens in your own company, the combination of a number of those things ought to get the CEO over the hump, if you will.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I'm always you make a really good point. Yeah, this stuff is always seen or almost always seen as purely a cost reduction effort. Nobody really thinks about the top line revenue opportunity that
right,
you can achieve because, if you're, for example, cutting down setup times, 90 minutes to 5 minutes, lead time to delivery to your customer can go down dramatically, not just because setup times reduce, but because the amount of variety you're then able to pump through your production process. And
right,
you can just deliver things faster to your customer. Not to mention, if you're implementing all those sorts of quality tools as well, you can really stand out and not just provide higher service level to your customer, but you can probably charge a higher price than your competitors. And so, why do you think that is often lost? Why is it seen purely as cost reduction? Is it because that's how we've largely advertised it, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think because I think the best definition for lean is really it's the best strategic way to run any company. But
Mm,
that isn't the way we've advertised it in the past. We've advertised it as a bunch of tools or different things like that. It's, people think of it more complicated. And then when they look at the results that people get, they say, well, they got a lot of cost reduction, and we always want cost reduction. Um, and so I think, people just get confused by that. They don't think of it as this is the best way to run any company, because every company really is the same. If you define a company, to me, a company is nothing more than a bunch of people and a group of processes trying to deliver value to a set of customers. That fits every single company. There's no company that doesn't apply to. The problem is if I come to your company, you're going to tell me, "Oh no, all right, it doesn't fit here. You can't believe how much more complicated we are. We have this and that, and our customers are a pain in the neck, and blah blah blah." Uh, so what you're really saying is, if you start out with the mentality that I don't think we can do this, then you're going to be correct, right?
mm,
Because whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're going to be correct. And so if you start out with a mentality that says this will never apply to us, that's going to be a big hurdle. You're not going to be able to do it. And I think one of my experiences in talking to other CEOs and stuff is one of the things I always say is, look, if you're going to go down the lean path, you have to understand that everything has to change. You
mm,
can't you can't just delegate this to the VP of operations and say cut the cost. Everything has to change, because if you don't, you won't get anywhere. And as soon as you say that, they say, "Oh, we can't do that. It's okay to send it down to the VP of operations and try and cut some costs." But the idea of everything has to change, that doesn't compute. They see that as too complicated, et cetera. But just as an example, when I first went to Wiremold, I knew that we were going to try and fix Wiremold by doing a lot of kaizen and level loading the factory, et cetera. So one of my first questions was, what percentage of our shipments ship in the last week of the month? Right? I mean, that's a question that anybody in manufacturing can ask inside their own company. And the answer was 50%. Said, whoa, wait a minute. How am I going to level load this if I have to ship 50% in the last week of the month? I said, first of all, if I'm geared up and have enough people to deal with 50% in the last week of the month, that means I'm way overstaffed for the other 3 weeks of the month. So that doesn't make any sense. And so when you ask that question in your own company, you're always going to find that the reason something like that occurs is because of something you did. Something
mm,
you did internally created that situation. And in our particular case, it was our sales terms. Our sales terms created the incentive for our electrical distributors, because Wiremo made electrical products for the electrical industry. We made raceway and fittings, things like that. And our distributors were incentivized to order in the last week of the month. So no surprise why that happened. So we just changed the sales terms.
mm.
We changed the sales terms. It started to level things out. We needed to do more after that, but that made a big dent in everything. And I think any
Well,
company will have the same result.
it's related to a question. This is from an anonymous audience member. But how do you see the sort of whole value stream rather than optimizing for specific departments that sales group may have thought they were performing really well, but actually they were hurting production, delivery. How do you get the whole organization to see the complete value stream so that you can optimize the organization versus a department?
Well, I think, if you're going to go from batch to flow, which is what you're going to do as you move from batching to lean, um, you've got to create the ability to have flow, and that means you have to go from functional departments. And think about functional departments. This means I put all the drilling machines near in one department. I put all the punch presses in another department. I don't know why you would do that. The only reason I can think of is people think that machines are happier if they're near other machines just like them or something, because it doesn't make any sense in terms of how you make the product. So I think one of the first things you have to do very, very early on, if you want to be successful in lean, is you have to create value streams. And then you have to give the value stream manager all the equipment necessary to make their product family complete. That takes away all the excuses. They have no more excuses. They got all the equipment. They have the raw material. They have the responsibility to the customer all the way out. And so once you've done that, that's a dramatic change from functional organization. And the reason that companies have such a struggle is that the waste that's in a functional organization is astronomical in my mind. My experience, companies that are organized into functional departments have 25 to 40% too many people. They have 50% too much space. They have 5 to 6 times too much inventory. They have long lead times, and they got periodic quality problems that they can't solve because if it takes 6 weeks for the product to get through all these functional departments, and then you find out you have a problem, a quality problem. How do you know where to go to solve it? Happened 6 weeks,
Mm.
right? So changing to value streams early on is a real must in this approach. If you don't do that, you're going to really struggle with this whole thing.
Well, sticking with the topic of departments, what about back office functions? This question comes here from Todd Schneider. You already talked a bit about your experience working with finance, but what about those administrative functions? How do you work with them? How do you engage them effectively?
Well, they just need to be part of the whole conversion to lean. For example, in finance, we first of all we had to get rid of standard cost accounting. That standard cost accounting incentivizes all the things we're trying to get rid of with lean. Plus, it doesn't give you very good information. You don't really know what's going on. You got this variance and that variance and this other variance, and the variances from something you made up at budget time. They're not even real. So it's a waste of time. So you got to start to convert from that very early on. So you can tell your finance department that, yeah, you got to do that, right? And then you can say, look, and we want you to use the lean tools. Instead of closing the books in 3 weeks, we want you to close the books in 3 days. So they're going to have to use the lean tools to do that because the lean approach applies in the office, it applies in the factory, it applies in a hospital, any place. And so, and same with human resources. Our human resources department, they did kaizens in human resources to organize everything, et cetera. And then they were very instrumental in how do we select people to come into the company. They did some of the initial training, different things like that. So all the what you could call back office functions have to be part of this.
Hmm.
You can't just say let them just go do whatever they were doing before.
Well, here's an interesting question. I guess we get this a lot, the Lean Six Sigma comparison here, but Dan Gustavusson, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He mentions that in one of your books, you mentioned Six Sigma was a bit of a distraction, or he says major distraction at GE, and he's asking about why that was, considering that Lean Six Sigma often considered to be complementary.
Okay, well, Six Sigma really started at GE shortly after I left. It
Mm.
wasn't, they weren't, Jack Welch wasn't pushing that when I was there. He started doing that a little bit later. Um, but the problem with doing it the way GE did it was they did that as that was kind of the strategy that they were trying to drive was Six Sigma. And the problem with Lean versus Six Sigma is that Six Sigma is only focusing on 10 or 20% of what's possible. For example, if there's 10 steps in a process, Six Sigma will go in and focus on one of them to try and make it better. They'll study it 6 months or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. It'll be all salary people doing this work. Um, and they'll get some gain. They'll probably improve that process. But the other nine processes are still broken, and you haven't really reduced the lead times or anything else. You just made one step in the process better. Whereas Lean is going to address all 10 of these steps. They're going to address everything. So from that point of view, I think the difference is pretty dramatic. And companies that go down the Six Sigma path as a strategy are just not going to get very far. They'll have a lot of they'll have a lot of Six Sigma success stories, but not much will change in terms of the bottom line. Now, we I'm not I'm not against Six Sigma. We use that. It made a lot of sense in a lot of cases to do it, but we did it in combination with Lean, not as a separate strategy aside and apart from Lean, which is that's where I have the issue is when you just do it that way. I don't think it's going to get you very far. You'll get some gains, but it won't get you very far.
And
Um,
also, the Six Sigma can also it can be an extremely effective tool, but it's often complicated. You're commonly doing some sort of statistical analysis, and most improvement really doesn't require that level of sophistication, proficiency, and you can inadvertently isolate improvement activity to a handful of very capable but few in number individuals versus opening up improvement opportunity to a much larger number of employees.
well, we had started some Six Sigma at Jake Brake before we started working with Shin Jiu-Jitsu, and we were all excited to show them and tell them what we were doing. They just laughed at us. They we said, well, why are you laughing? What?
Oop. Looks like Art's feed has frozen here. Just give me a moment. And if you see Art's feed frozen as well, just put it in the chat there so I can confirm that. Hi, everybody. Apologize again for the disruption here. I'm speaking with Art, and it looks like he's having an internet connectivity issue. We may be able to resolve it, but we're going to ask you to hang on for just another minute or two as we try to troubleshoot the problem. Apologize for this, and thank you for your patience. I'm going to step away again so I can continue my conversation with Art as we try to get back on.